I believe that everyone has joined. I'd like to say a warm welcome to all of you and ask my colleague Selena to flip to the next slide, please, and acknowledge that today I am joining from the traditional lands of the Kosapsun and the Lekwungen speaking families and ancestors who have been incredible stewards of this land, these lands where Royal Roads University is located since time immemorial. And I am so grateful in particular to be a visitor on these lands, an uninvited guest since 2003. And I have the privilege of living near a place called Migan in the Lekwungen language. And Migan is, you can see in the forefront of this photo, there's a little bit of the camas flower, and camas was a food and still is a food eaten by the people indigenous to this particular place. And camas flowers, camas bulbs were and continue to be cultivated in the Migan area. The English name is Beacon Hill Park, and I'm so very grateful to live and work on these traditional lands. Next slide, please, Selena. So this webinar is hosted by the Masters of Arts in Global Leadership. And joining us today, we have Program Head, Dr. Wanda Kraus. So over to you, Wanda, to say a few words about this webinar series and the suite of global leadership programs that you oversee.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everyone. I am so pleased to see everyone joining from so many different places, some of the places I've recognized, been to. So such a joy to see the breadth of participation in this webinar. It's an exciting webinar that we've been looking forward to with Adrianne Lickers Xavier, Dr. Adrianne Xavier Lickers Xavier. She has graduated from Royal Roads University in the doctorate program. So we're very proud and lucky to have had her with us. Currently, Dr. Adrian is acting director with the Indigenous Studies program at McMaster University. Previously has also been an associate professor lecturer at Queen's University, and is doing exciting work along the lines of Indigenous approaches and offering Indigenous perspectives to food security, and has also contributed to Food Security, a book that Dr. Idmansky has also edited and written in, and so we'll also introduce a little bit around and also a little bit of a competition towards the end that Catherine will introduce the process for in just a moment. At the MA in Global Leadership, we have a suite of different webinars. This is our third, our third already. And we've got 2 more coming up. All our webinar topics seek to address from different perspectives and through different topics wicked problems from a global perspective. And so we do that by speaking to usually a local challenge or issue that's related to global challenges. And so we connect the local to the global through these various different examples that we bring to you through our program. Today, it's an Indigenous perspective that we're looking forward to. We also have at this very moment our students joining us for the first time in a hybrid model. So we're very excited to see students joining online with you as well. We have students in the next room to me where I'm located at Royal Roads University joining as well. So a very exciting time, a very challenging time. And we're looking forward to hearing how with one of the challenges we have that relate to us locally, but affects communities globally, we might think of or use perspectives that are extremely supportive and helpful. Thank you very much. And next slide, Selena.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Wanda, and hello, one and all, whether you're joining online or in person, just one room over from me. These are funny times. I can take my mask off when I'm in the next room to speak on this webinar. So hello to all of my my friends, my students, my colleagues who are in the next room, and those of you joining online. It's wonderful to be here. As Wanda mentioned, Dr. Lickers has a chapter in this book, and we have a giveaway. We have a surprise giveaway that will be offering a copy of this book. I have one copy for the in-person crowd, and I have one copy for the online crowd. So I'll tell you a little bit more about how we'll do that toward the end of the webinar. But for the time being, I'll just mention that the book is called Leadership in Adult Learning for Global Food Systems Transformation. So this is a book about food leadership, and Dr. Lickers Xavier's chapter is titled Longhouse to Greenhouse, the Path to Food Security at 6 Nations. So she'll be talking a bit more about that later, and we'll offer a copy to those of you in the audience. So next slide, please, Selena. I'll just say a couple of words. Here's another slide just introducing myself, but I'd like to offer a few words of introduction about the concept of food security. Some of you who are joining today might be very familiar. I know, for example, that some of the global leadership students I met yesterday, some of you grew up on a farm, or you have ancestors who worked on a farm. So the notion of food and how we come together around food and the hard work it takes to grow and produce food is not a foreign concept to some of you, but some of you might not be familiar with the idea of food security. So Selena, if you could flip to the next slide, please. I'd like to offer a basic definition of food security that was put forward by the Food and Agricultural Organization. This was in 2003, so a number of years ago now, but this definition still stands. And it has evolved actually over the years to become a little bit more, well, let's say to attempt to become a little bit more culturally sensitive and inclusive. So I've underlined a couple of key words here. There's a social element, and there's the idea of food preferences. So this isn't just any access to food whatsoever, like let's say canned goods or some of the foods that have been introduced into Indigenous communities that have caused harm historically and continue to, which we'll probably hear a little bit more from Adrian in a few minutes. But the idea that food security is a situation where all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and their preferences, so cultural preferences, social preferences for an active and healthy life. So I've offered the reference here to the Food and Agriculture Organization. You might also want to take at another recent doctoral graduate from Royal Roads University, Dr. Vanessa Dater. Wanda Krause and I recently oversaw her doctoral dissertation that was looking at how to evaluate the impacts of community food initiatives through a food systems approach. So she was really looking at food security and how to evaluate whether food security exists or not. So this is important work, you know, especially here, the colonial name Victoria. Victoria is on an island. You know, at one point, of course, there was 100% food security here when Indigenous peoples inhabited this land and cultivated the lands and harvested from the lands. There was 100% food security, but that food security has declined over time through colonization. And of course, lately with the global pandemic, we're seeing supply issues. And so there are concerns about how to get food to the island now in this current state of a little bit more instability. And of course, this isn't unique to Vancouver Island. It happens all around the world as well. So Selena, if you could flip to the next slide, please. There's a related concept of Indigenous food sovereignty. So it's not just about security, it's about having sovereignty over one's food and access to one's food. So Don Morrison, the author of this particular quote, also runs an organization called Indigenous Food Systems Network. I've inserted a link to that at the bottom of these slides for those who want to go back and take a look later. But of course, Adrian will be offering more information about Indigenous food sovereignty. And for the time being, I'll just mention that this is a description of the ability of Indigenous communities to sustain traditional hunting, fishing, gathering, farming, and distribution practices the way we have done for thousands of years prior to contact with the first European settlers. So this is a movement that Adrian will be telling us a little bit more about, and how she herself has been a leader in this movement. So Selena, in the interest of time, I'd actually like to ask that you skip over the next slide, or the next two slides, please, and move down to the slide that talks about why this is important right now. So yes, industrial agriculture and the global transport of food produces 20% of the world's greenhouse gases. So we know that this is a global challenge. And there are many, many ways that food security impacts all of us all around the world. And perhaps if we have time at the end to take a few questions, we can get into this a little bit more. But in general, suffice it to say that the UN has been calling for a paradigm shift, a fundamental shift in how global agriculture operates since 2013. So a long time now, and we're still catching up. But thankfully, through leaders like Adrian, we're seeing some headway being made in this area. So Selena, on to the last slide, please. If I could just offer a little bit of information about food leaders. It's hard to find information specifically about food leaders and food leadership, but I did find this one wonderful framework by Paul Cack, where he talked about the different kind of leaders who are needed for this movement of food leadership to transform, to fundamentally transform the paradigm of agriculture that we're in. So of course, there are the formal and the informal educators and researchers, and then there are the visionary leaders. Some of you, I know many of you are from India who are joining today. Maybe you've heard of Dr. Vandana Shiva. Even those of you outside of India might have heard of Vandana Shiva's work. She is a visionary leader who is promoting the idea of food security at a global perspective. And then, of course, there are the innovators, the people who are actually taking this vision and taking the education, and they're trying to apply it in practice and in action. And then there are the mobilizers and the networkers, the community organizers. And then there are people who operate within their own domain. So for example, doctors or even religious leaders or scientists who are calling attention to this need for a fundamental paradigm shift within the food system. And they're not necessarily food scientists themselves, but they are calling attention to this need to change the way we operate. And I would like to suggest that Dr. Adrianne Xavier Lickers is perhaps a little bit of all of the above in the way that she approaches food leadership. And so having laid the groundwork for this work, let me pass it over to you, Adrian, to say a bit more about what you've been up to and how you've been actually applying some of this work in practice. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. First of all, welcome to everybody. I have to confess that it's very exciting to be here, in part because I am super interested, and I'm going to be following up to hear more about the idea of the hybrid class that's going on. So there are people at Royal Roads. I myself was a blended learner, so I got to be on campus only for a very short time each time. I did my master's and my doctoral work at Royal Roads, and I'm envious of the view that Wanda has, because that was my classroom. So if you're across the hall from her, then you also are getting that same view, which for me is an important place to start, because you are going to connect to the places that you are. So a piece of what I'm going to talk about today is, and I'm going to check the clock first so that I don't go wild and keep you here all day. A big important piece of this is connecting, good and truly connecting to all the people who have told us where they're here from. Where are you joining from? Where are you connected to? Where are the places that you are not just living, but existing and forming relationships and being part of? And that's important to the agricultural conversation, it's important to the food conversation, it's important to the culture conversation. All of these things are intertwined, which is part of the reason why, for me, it's always really exciting. Food is very much a connector of people and things. I'm going to go right back to the first slide about food security as a definition. So Catherine was very clear. The FAO has defined food security, and I appreciate that, because sometimes we need to have boundaries and structure to understand things. But one of the other things that we need to understand is there are always places where growth and change can occur. So in that description, Dr. Atmansky mentioned culture, but it's not actually in this definition. On the surface of things, if you, for example, are looking at this from an academic outside the world, just looking in at that description, that doesn't seem to matter. We're talking about having enough food. We're talking about having an active and healthy life, dietary needs, sufficient, safe, nutritious food. That should be the same, right? That's why we have food guidance. That's why there's a Canada Food Guide. The difficulty is if you live, for example, in a country or a space or a community where a huge percentage of your community are lactose intolerant. Is the dairy section of the food guide useful to you? I mean, sure, I suppose it's useful to be like, okay, avoid that whole section. But I live in a community where dairy is always it's a bit of a crapshoot for us. Truthfully, we are an agricultural people, but we're not dairy farmers. We are corn, beans, and squash. We are Three Sisters growers. We are agricultural people, but we're also hunters. We're omnivorous people. We believe in the whole system being important to our food, but residential schools and history of colonization have separated us from that. So that definition is really important, and it actually is important on two levels. I start every single talk that I do, and I'm not gonna vary from that just yet until I get to a point where I feel like it's not necessary. For me, food security is important to remember that when we talk about food security, we're actually talking about the lack of it, the absence of. Food security makes it sound like we have something. We, in fact, do not. Food security is all about being insecure in our food access. So it's a marketing piece in my brain sometimes, because talking about food security is actually talking about who doesn't have enough. So in every single classroom, in every room that you attend, in every meeting that you'll ever go to in your life, there is absolutely a chance, and I say a chance, it would be a shock if it were not true every single time, 100% of the time, you will be in a room with at least one person who has experienced food insecurity. Now, that gets into the conversation of food sovereignty when we think about the fact that food sovereignty, I have yet to find someone who absolutely holds that. Because if we're going to talk about food sovereignty as the ability to make choices and have control of where we source our food, what the food is and what it is not, we don't live in a world where that actually occurs unless you are absolutely self-sustaining and you want to be. And I say that because when it comes to food security, here's my one, I'll jump on the soapbox for just a minute. If all you have in your house is Pop-Tarts and frozen pizza, then eat Pop-Tarts and frozen pizza. I'm never going to say, oh, you shouldn't eat those things. I'm going to say, do you have access to food? Good. I'm happy. That helps me to know that you have the first step in working your way towards food sovereignty. However, if all you have in your house is Pop-Tarts and frozen pizza, you are one really tiny step towards food sovereignty. If you think that that's the only thing that you actually want, then you have all of the hard work of figuring out what it is that got you to that place, to think that that is what you have, what you want, what you deserve, and what you need. Because at the end of this, food sovereignty is about choosing and having control. I tell people all the time, and it's going to sound funny, and it's a silly quote, and I love being the Grinch, so I don't mind. If you've ever seen Jim Carrey's version of the Grinch, you will know that I would like to solve world hunger and tell no one. I'll tell you why. If I were actually to solve world hunger, which I secretly have done many times over every single day, I wouldn't need to tell a single soul, because the truth is as a collective as a community, as a group of people, as individuals, if we could find the way to successfully attain some level of food sovereignty within our own home, we would already know how to grow food. We would know how to trade it. We would know how to have access to the systems where we can source it and make our own choices, in which case we would have it. Because end of the day, we know this should be true. There is enough food in the world to feed everyone. But does it make us food sovereign? Not at all. Does it make us food secure? No, because people will not always share what they have, and people do not always want what is shared. I know people who turn down food bank items because they're not good for them. They're not healthful for their bodies. That's not a judgment on what the food bank is doing. That is a person knowing where they stand. So I ran a program with, and I'll just say with my mom, called the Our Sustenance program. And it started out as a farmer's market in a community garden. And I was the first market volunteer and the only person at the market in 2011. My mom unwittingly was the first silent volunteer, processing all the food that didn't get sold or given away at the end of each market, canning things, freezing things. So in 2011 and then the start of 2012, that's what we did as a volunteer. And I slowly found a way. I started working there, she started working there, and we created the Our Sustenance program. Now, in my community of Six Nations, which is Southern Ontario, Haudenosaunee territory, part of this Six Nations history, also known as the Iroquois, our traditional region is the Finger Lakes region of Upper New York State. We were individual nations who came together collectively to work together. Part of that also had to do with us sourcing, growing food. We were movers by nature. So we grew food in a certain region, we hunted in another region, we lived, we wintered, we summered in different places, which to me sounds great. It's like the notion of, being a snowbird. You go to the places where you're comfortable and you hunker down in the wintertime. And then when it's nice out, you go to the places where it's beautiful. And think about Southern Ontario and the Greenbelt. It's really nice here. And food will grow plentiful. That we were smart. We knew how to do that, but we knew how to trade. We knew how to share goods. We knew how to share seeds. We knew how to grow our own food and then collect and hunt for what we didn't already have. We didn't need to house it somewhere to hunt it. We knew how to eat what was there. So these are all the historical pieces. And I say historical, I still know people who hunt. My mom still gets people who give her venison. We still have, we have rabbits in the freezer right now. There are lots of foods that are part of this region that are invaluable to us physically for the food they bring, but also culturally and socially. Part of what makes us as a community and a culture happy is for everyone to be housed, everybody to be happy, and everybody to be fed. If that's a piece of food sovereignty, then it is vital that everyone has enough, or we're never going to be happy and healthy and housed. Because if everyone doesn't have enough, then we are all not without enough. It is a collective understanding of community. So it's really important when we're talking about food security and food sovereignty to understand that there are, by nature, pieces of it that require us to step outside of our own small family unit. Food sovereignty as an individual could mean that I would like to be able to control what I bring in, but at the end of the day, I can grow certain things here, but I have no choice but to shop at certain stores because that's what's in my area. So understanding that level of control is important. What can I do individually? What can I bring in? And what do I have time, capacity, and ability for? I never ever tell a person, like some people, and I respect this, I love it. Some people grow their own food, they source it, they have their own animals. We kept chickens. We had like a grow your own section. We had lessons on how to garden. We had how to plan your garden for what you wanted. We had a market garden. We kept horses for compost. We had an herbal apothecary. This program, and in the chapter of the book that Dr. Mansky mentioned, I talk about what this program was, and it started out as a food access program, much like people would think of a food bank, only it was a place for people to access in the community, locally, taking into account the issues around colonialism and the realities of my community. What it also did, though, was give people a doorway to choose more of their food, be more in control of where and when and what they chose to eat. That's a big empowerment moment. If you grow your own food, you absolutely have so much more choice than someone else to be able to do that. And it's a huge, amazing thing. And people don't always think about that. So I really like to highlight that piece of it, because one of the things that we taught people, to me, was really practical stuff. You know, how do you plan for your garden? Do you know how much room it takes? Do you know how many seeds you need for that? Because if you've not had enough, there's a tendency to want to take a little extra just in case. But people don't think about the fact that that one tiny seed that's like half the size of my nail will grow a cucumber plant that will spread 12 feet across your yard. And that one seed is enough for you to have probably cucumbers for the summer. And if you wanted a bunch of them, you need to have the space for that. And if you don't have the space for that, what can you do still? What if all you have is a front porch? What if you don't have a yard? What if you don't have any land? I'm really fortunate. I have a lot of land and I have a lot of trees. I have 5 gardens in my yard. I also have a lot of help with weeding and planting and watering and things, because it's a lot. My mom is a master gardener. I am just more of I'm an observer of gardening. I always tell her that I'm happy to buy the cream for our coffee. But the truth is when you can teach someone that one small piece to start, they then have the ability to start and make more choices for themselves. What else do I want? What is next? And that's when you get into people asking questions of local food, of changing their food systems, of knowing that they know who produced their food and wanting it to be local. The pandemic has given us, and I'm calling it a silver lining opportunity. It has given us a great opportunity to build relationships with those close to us, in part because we didn't really have a choice. When the production is there, but it doesn't actually get to us because all of our vegetables are produced in California and Mexico, for example, and there are no truck drivers, what are we supposed to have? Suddenly, the people that we're counting on the most are those small greenhouse producers that are local, that are within 100 kilometers of us, that are, less than 10 hours away, because it can get to us by the grocery store and actually still be usable. So it has created a lot of conversation. One of the things that the program that I ran with my mom did was it really showed me the way that people think about food. I'm going to ask you guys a question, and it's a simple one. You can answer, you can put things in, you can put your thumbs up, you can raise your hand, you can do those things. How many of you, when someone comes to your home, the first thing that you want to do is welcome them in? I mean, COVID rules aside for just a second, you invite them in and you offer them something to eat. Like that's a cultural thing. It's a social thing. It feels like a human thing. But what we started teaching people was that what are the things you can do if you don't have a lot to offer? Because there's a lot of personal concern, shame, issue if you don't have anything to give. What if we don't have enough? I don't have enough for me, let alone for someone who stops by. What do I offer them? You offer coffee, you offer tea. People turn it down. They want to be respectful because that person doesn't have a lot. But part of our nature and our culture was to share. So if you turn someone down when it's truly their gift, it's the only gift they have to offer you, that relationship tells you what you mean to them. And we do that for each other all the time, but we've turned it into something social. It still is a piece of our culture. It's still a piece of our community building. So one of the things that I did when I was doing my research was I actually watched a lot. I mean, I watched a lot of programming happen. As the manager of the program, I got to be that person who observed, stood in the back corner, chatted with people, welcomed folks. But then I observed. I got to observe relationships growing. I got to observe knowledge happening. There were a lot of things that really occurred. there are some pieces of this that are important. And I see in the chat that Anna is talking about the ability for wild meat to be shared. So one of the conversations that I had when I was running the program was with a lady who was from, she was working at the Arctic College actually, so in the Yukon. And as a non-Indigenous person, she has no right to trade or purchase any of the game. But that's literally the meat source. That's the protein source of her community. And so we got into a chat one day about how do I address that, because I can't just walk into, you know, somebody's place and say, hey, do you have some whatever that meat may be, and then give them money for it. And they won't accept money for it because they can't. Culturally, that's not appropriate. So socially, it's also not appropriate. There are some fantastic things that are going on in communities right now just for that reason. So Najimo Tag is a community program on Manitoulin Island, and they started a program that actually was based on something that we had done here at Six Nations called Healthy Roots, which was pre-contact food. And what they did was they got a grant to mirror that program. And what they set up was a community freezer. So hunters could go, they could fill that freezer, they got it processed, they paid for it, and they gave. People gave them gifts in return. And giving a gift or a trade is completely appropriate. It is acceptable, which is the same thing I recommended to my friend who lived in the Arctic. I said, you know what? If you have a local store, and I don't care what the store is for, I don't care if it's goods, I don't care if it's groceries, I don't care if it's like tea towels or whatever it might be, do they offer a gift card? You're not giving them money, you're giving them a gift. You can trade in that way. You can create your own economy, and you can create your own relationship to that food system. If you are an insider of the food system, if you are, a sidelong to that, because I'm not going to say outsider, you are still part of that food system. If you live in that community, you are part of that food system. If you are sidelong to that cultural community, you can still be part of that economy without it having to be money, because money is not the only way that food sovereignty or food security are going to work. So they created a freezer, and people in need, people who had enough but could share, were able to share. Those who did not have enough, or perhaps like myself, there's no one in my house who hunts. People in my community who know that will donate to my mom and I. We will trade, we give them things, we do work together, and then we get the things that we need that we don't automatically have access to. Where my mom grows a lot of things she can. She makes chili sauce, we do lots of jams, we do jellies, we do things. We share those things in return. There are a lot of ways that that small act translate to the larger picture. So I don't want to get lost on the time, because I know that I'm trying to make sure I want to cover as many things as I possibly can. But one of the things that I want to talk about very quickly is the fact that my research focused specifically, and I did use an autoethnographic approach. I told the story of being the person who got to operate that system, which is one of the reasons why, and I have to confess that, I would be honored to be all of the representatives of that leadership conversation that Dr. Mansky mentioned, because being an innovator is part of being a visionary. It's part of being a mobilizer. It's part of being an educator. I get to dance through all of these worlds because I have hands-on experience as a person who is part of that food system. As someone who has studied it, I also have the ability to share that knowledge. But what I am interested in, and hopefully if I'm super lucky, my next piece of that is going to be finding ways to compare, first and foremost, where those systems of food security and sovereignty work are being done, and how successful are they? What are the best parts of it? What are the practical pieces that are working well? And looking at the model of translation. Because for me, there were certain pieces that really worked well with Our Sustenance that are still going on in my community, even though Our Sustenance is not active. They are the pieces, of course, and I mean, I get to be a little bit smug about it. They're the pieces that my mom still carries on working in her new job as a food animator. That's the official title for all things related to food, which she does. That's garden lessons, that's canning classes, that's cooking over a fire, that's bringing people together for animal tracks and snacks so that little kids learn how to track small animals that they could be hunting one day. It's learning how to follow the migration patterns and understand what nature is providing for us so that we know what food is going to be available in the fall. Food is not a quick process. Fast food is the ultimate joke, because the truth is the slow food movement, which has been around for decades, tells us to do things whole food, slowly, in a good way. Food sovereignty tells us to do things from even farther back than that. Start with a seed, start with the soil, start with a relationship. Make friends with the farmer who lives next door. Make friends with the lady who has the huge garden. If you don't know how to do it yet, somebody does. If you want to do it and you haven't yet, find out what it takes. Start small. Put a pot on your patio. The next thing you know, you're going to have like half a dozen garden boxes all over your yard, and people are going to be like, oh, she's turned into the crazy garden lady. Own it. You know, get the apron, buy the knee pad, carry the little thing, always have seeds in your pocket. Be the person. If you're not that person, don't judge yourself. I can't say that enough. When it comes to food and the food system that we're in, understand that every person has a role. It's important to be part of the system and build the relationship. And the relationship is you to the place that you live, to the food that grows there. That's the ultimate first step, because once you know things that are local to you, you start to understand what's in season. And when you know what's in season, the food tastes better. When you know how to do it yourself, satisfaction level increases exponentially. If your ability, you have a hectic job, you have kids, change your perspective and open it up a little bit. Because when you can do that, then things like food security and food sovereignty, they sneak in. And you don't think about, well, I should be doing this. I need to eat this kind of lifestyle in order to. No, you don't. You need to eat. You need to have enough. You need to have a relationship. Your body needs to have a relationship to food. And the more you build that relationship and you nurture it, that to me is the ultimate form of self-care. That's the way that your body is like, we love us. You love us and you're caring for us. And then you start to do that for others. And the next thing you know, you're that lady who is like dropping off zucchinis on everyone's porch when they're not looking. Or tomatoes. It happens with tomatoes too, because people get excited. They think I have one plant, I should have 6. And then they don't realize that every single tomato plant has like 96 tomatoes and it's gone wild. And the next thing you know, they're like, I don't know what to do with these things. Just for the record, freeze them. It works out great. But inevitably people start, passing them off. Build connections to people as well. And all of those things literally are part and parcel of relationship building to food, to community, to culture, to food security, or lack thereof, as I'm always clear to say. Food security is about not having, not about having extra. I better stop now because, otherwise I'll carry on for another day and a half.
Thank you, Dr. Adrianne. There are so many nuggets in your brief talk that I'm sure we can spend another 24 hours talking. But maybe I'll go straight to, there's one question I see in the chat at least, and then several comments. But to get us started with questions and answers, I'm looking at the question saying, how has this food access program been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic? If you can comment, please.
So the program that we actually operated ended in 2018 officially, but many of the facets of it continue on through my mom with Six Nations Health Services. Interestingly enough, the pandemic has created, for me actually, and since we're in a Zoom room and Royal Roads is my home base, it has brought me home. Because what they have started doing is finding ways to innovate, bring food to people in different ways with information in different ways. So just as a quick example, in 2020, the first thing that happened was they pitched 2 projects. One was a drive-through market, no contact, pre-selected foods every week for a low cost. You drive through, you drop $10 in a bucket, and the next station you get food in a bag that gets put in your vehicle at the back without contact to the person. Suddenly you have access to food every single week, fresh vegetables. It is operated very similar to something that is Googleable, which is the Good Food Box program, which was started in Toronto actually several years ago, whereby you would make a relationship with either a farmer or like a food producer, food sourcer, so that you can get the best price possible for a bulk order, which is what they do. So that was one of the first things that they did. So my community right now actually has a weekly market. It's $10. They get 10 items, sometimes 11, sometimes 9, but it depends on what the items are. And what they're trying to include now more than ever is every single week, as possible, or at least once a month, one item that is culturally appropriate or cultural food. So they've had venison jerky, they've had corn, which is like our traditional white corn. They've had, and every single week when it goes out, there's also different recipes and also how to treat that food, so that people might be getting something they're not accustomed to, they'll still know what to do with it. The other thing that happened was they immediately started planning for a garden program. Everybody was stuck at home, food was difficult to source, and people were actually genuinely just afraid to go out. So in 2020, they created a program, they got funding, 500 gardens went out into the community. We are a community of about 15,000. And we have multi-generational homes where we'll have anywhere from 4 to 16 people living in a house. So 500 gardens went out, compost, an actual square 4x4 garden bed, all of the things to go in it, seeds and plants as well. So those went out the first year, and the same thing happened again in 2021. Anyone who had one the year before got plants again the next year, or seeds, and new people were able to ask for the garden beds, or if they didn't have it and they only had a porch, they got, we did food grade blue barrels cut in half, and they got soil to go into those and plants to go into that, so that if, for example, elders who don't really get around very well and the ground is uneven, they got to have a garden on their porch. So right off the hop, there were a lot of things. The other thing that my mom organized as soon as our lockdowns, because our community actually closed its borders. You could go out to grocery shop, but by and large, there were actual like checkpoints at the entrances and exits of our community. The other thing that they organized right away was an emergency food program where people could contact and get 4 to 5 days worth of food for families, anywhere from 1 to 2 people up to however many lives in your house. And they adjusted it based on how many people were in the home. So my mom organized that as well, with a full diet, not like, okay, the food bank says you get, 3 canned goods and this bag of pasta and this. It was like, here's snacks, here's breakfast, here's lunches, here's protein, here are the carbohydrates, here's your vegetables. It was full scale, including like shelf stable milk. So boxes of cereal, like a very large component of food. There was actually just, there were so many things that went on. The other things that occurred, some of my favorite things that occurred were things like a class called Soup Share. My mom has a penchant for making up soup recipes. And she made up soup recipes. And what happens is once a week for 6 weeks, you sign up for the class. They did 20 people last time, I think. And those 20 people get a delivery on their porch of the supplies needed for that week's soup. You go on Zoom that night, 2 hours, you sit with my mom, she gives you all the tips, tricks, and ideas for how to make a very fulsome, multi-layered, hearty soup. So your family is 3 or 4 people, whatever it may be, she usually did for enough for 3 to 6 people. You would get the actual lesson of how to make that soup with her, so that while it was happening, you can ask questions, she could show you, and she did it herself, so you could follow along. Really simple, and I say simple, I mean, in my house, it's like super simple. For her, honestly, the hardest part was, okay, how do I figure out how to make a Zoom that lasts for 6 weeks? That was it. Like, these are just really simple things. So there's a lot of activities that went on like that, that were like just immediate. How do we connect people to food?
We've got a lot of comments in the chat, Adrian, that are building on what you have presented. Lots of sharing of ideas as well that you've got motivated. So it's just beautiful to see all this sharing in the chat for everyone. we've got maybe one question more that we can squeeze in. And it's a related question to what you've just addressed as well. And Catherine's asking, I'm curious about your observations on the personal empowerment that you've seen through folks learning to grow or act in small ways for themselves. I think it's a beautiful question. So we'll squeeze that one in.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually saw that as well. So I did an interview once, my mom and I, and I talk about my mom all the time, like she works with me. She does sometimes, actually. I got her to teach the traditional ecological knowledge classes for me at McMaster last year. One of the things, so my mom's name is Adrianne Lickers. One of the things that we talked about once, there was an interview that was done by the CBC and Gulf University. And they were asking me questions about the program and what we did. And my mom just made this really casual statement. She said, there's a sense of empowerment in being able to provide for yourself and your family. And one of the things that people don't think about, I think, often enough, is the importance of giving yourself credit for what you are capable of doing. Very often we think about, oh, we don't have enough, I didn't get the laundry done, I didn't do this, I didn't, and you have a garden outside and it's successful, and then you're like, oh, I should have weeded it more, it needed more water, and I don't know why this plant didn't do, what I thought it would, or my cucumbers were bad. And if you ask around, probably this year the cucumbers were all bad. Last year it was green peppers, the year before that it was cucumbers. Part of that is the region that you live in. Sometimes it just happens, sometimes it's the batch of seeds that went out, sometimes it's just like, that's what we have to understand about nature. So when I talk about the empowerment that we've seen, I have seen some of the most beautiful things occur in my time working in this community. I've watched young moms who went back to school and finished high school because they had learned how to control some part of their community, some part of their food system. By having the ability to do that, it empowered them to feel in control of some part of their lives, and it pushed them to want more. I've seen people who were very food insecure by nature, our health changes, and they're the same people who are now running like community level support groups for those who want to reconnect to food, culture, language, community. There are people who have, oh my God, I could probably have spent an entire hour talking about some of the amazing stories of things that I've seen. Watching children who start out the school year meeting with my mom in our old greenhouse, which is huge, and her asking questions like, do you know where groceries come from? And they're like, well, duh, theirs. And I'm like, oh, no. I mean, yes, that's where your mom gets it, but that's not where it comes from. And them having no idea that the food that got into that building came from somewhere else. That's the only place, that was the end product for them. Was they were start and finish was theirs, that or No Frills or whatever the grocery store is, Sobeys, that kind of thing. And then holding up things like a leaf or a piece of broccoli and saying, do you know what this is? And them not really knowing, and then holding up a freezer bag and then being like, oh, that's Green Giant. Okay, but Green Giant what? And they're like, I don't know. And in their house, whatever it became, whatever it is that was the most popular vegetable in their house. So it was either corn or peas or green beans or whatever, but never the actual food. And then at the end of that same school year, having those students have grown their own garden. And probably one of my favorite stories of all time of that entire program was the first year that my mom worked with our immersion students. So they used their time in our greenhouse as their outdoor classroom gym time. And at the end of the school year, one of the girls I had gone to high school with came up to me in the grocery store, unbeknownst to me. And she's like, so I'm like, hi, how are you doing? She's like, I'm growing cucumbers in my yard. I'm like, cool. And watermelons. I'm like, that's nice. My kids barely even come inside now. They eat snack right out of the garden. I'm like, okay. Like I couldn't put the two of them together. I didn't know why. Come to find out that I know her daughter because she was in classes with my mom. And I was like, oh, okay. And my brain wouldn't go fast enough. And I'm like, that's great. So the kids are enjoying it. She's like, yeah, you can tell they've been hanging out with your mom. And she was like a little bit accusatory, and I thought it was like the best moment for me, because as it turned out, that particular summer, 7 families of that classroom of 30 kids or whatever it was, and I think it was much smaller than that actually, 7 families had gardens for the very first time because the children demanded it. That to me was a level of empowerment in the community that I had never seen. We have to have a garden because Miss Kitty said that this is where our food's going to come from, because if I don't grow food now, I won't know where it comes from when I'm grown up and I have kids, which is gross, but she said. And like, these are the kinds of lessons, these are the levels of involvement that you can get in community. And I'm just gonna, the only piece of that I'm gonna say is, when it comes to empowerment, this is anyone, anywhere on earth is capable of that kind of empowerment. I don't care where you live. If you can empower your children to learn or be confident enough to try something new, you will have to follow them, because you, as their parent, your caregiver, your, as an auntie, whatever that may be, you will be beholden to their future, and you will make yourself be successful at it because you don't want to let them down. That's genuine empowerment from below and from above, because as kids, they believe you when you tell them they can do anything.
Adrian, it's just delightful to hear you chatting with such enthusiasm and confidence, and to share these stories of inspiration. As you said, the FAO definition of food security and food sovereignty, these are aspirational. We're not there yet, as you said, but you've shared stories that are inspirational. So thank you ever so much. Wanda, did you have any final words as we're moving toward the end of the webinar here?
I just want to say that under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, for most of you, I welcome you now to choose whichever comes to you to congratulate, thank, share your feelings with Adrian for this beautiful webinar. Thank you so much, Adrian. I've learned a lot, and it's so inspiring to see how these little acts, as you've mentioned, can be so empowering. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Well, gosh, we're coming down to a close here after these inspiring words. Adrian, if you have a moment to scroll through the chat, you'll see so much love and appreciation and questions. There was even one question at the end: how do seeds? How do planting seeds fit in with Indigenous food sovereignty? So we'll have to leave that question for another time, or perhaps stay on for till the bitter end here, or the sweet end, shall we say. But Selena, could I ask you to pop up the last slides for me, please, on the webinar slide deck? And we have, thank you. We have a couple more webinars coming up. Wanda, did you want to say a couple words about these final few webinars that are coming up?
Yeah, so we've got just 2 more webinars coming up from our series of 5. The next one is February 15th and is on global leadership and internationalization, where we're joined by graduates of the Global Leadership Program to talk about their experiences. And I won't go into details around that, so it's a bit of a surprise, but we're talking about internationalization and experiences around going international and doing projects within Canada as well, to illustrate the interconnections and the connection, especially between the local and global. So exciting contributions on that day. The framing of the talk on that day is thinking about, especially during such turbulent times as now with COVID, how we can do better to lean out into the world. So to reach out to the global, and also at the same time to think about where we are in context and connect those two. The one after that, the last one of the series, is diversity is not enough. So we have a guest speaking about not just diversity, but especially the emphasis will be inclusion from his own perspective, coming to Canada and working through the challenges of not assimilating, but integrating into Canada. So making that distinction during this webinar and putting forward some ideas and just awareness around the challenges that is often faced, and how we can be more inclusive here as well. So I'll leave it at that, given the time. If we can hang on just for a few more minutes, I'll pass it back to you, Catherine, to talk about your book giveaway.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. So we have a fun way to do this. For those of you who are here on campus in person, I do have a copy of the book. It's in Lisa Korak's hand, so you can take a look from Lisa. We'll leave it in the classroom for you to browse. And for those of you who are still with us online, what we're going to do, as I hold this book up here, what we're going to do is just do a countdown. I'll say 3, 2, 1, and then the first person to click on the raise hand button. So the first person whose hand goes up in the chat, Selena's going to be monitoring that. Cynthia, good practice, excellent job. And I'll just ask you to lower your hand, and then I'll do the official countdown for everyone to join. And we will send, thank you, Jay, good practice. So everyone just hang tight. We're going to do the official countdown, and then the first person after I say one on the countdown will be the person who gets the draw. Okay, so everyone get ready, go to your reactions tab, find the raise hand. So notice that's different from the applause. You want to find the raise hand button. And here we go with the countdown. After I say the number 1, it'll be the first person to raise their hand. So 3, 2, 1. Oh, 40 people with their hands raised. And it looks like our winner is Selena. Could you please share with me the winner?
Our winner is Charlotte.
Charlotte, congratulations, Charlotte. Wonderful. So congratulations. Thanks everybody for playing. What I would offer, Charlotte, is if you want to privately get in touch with my colleague, either Selena or Imara, perhaps just if somebody could inform Charlotte in the chat where to send her private mailing address so we can get a copy of the book out to her. If you get that over to me, I'll send it out to Charlotte. And if I could ask someone to pop in the chat as well, where you can buy a copy of the book. At one point, there was a preview of the first 3 chapters online. We'll see if we can find that for you as well, so that you can have a little bit of access to the book if you don't want to buy it. But if you do want to buy it, I'll ask someone to pop that in the chat. And Selena, if you could finally please put the slide that has all of our contact information. Thank you so much. I know you've stayed on for a few extra moments here. If anyone is interested in learning more about the suite of global leadership programs, we've got, like I said, we have a number of in-person people, students here. We're so delighted that they finally arrived after this long pandemic. So we've got in-person programs, we've got blended programs that mix the face-to-face and the online. We've got graduate certificates, diplomas, and master's degrees, all kinds of information. So please feel free to contact our enrollment advisors. If you're joining us internationally, there are international admissions and registration advisors. So you can see the phone numbers and the email addresses there. And of course, if you'd like to get in touch with either Wanda or me, if you'd like to contact the School of Leadership Studies more directly, leadership.admin@royalroads.ca is how you can find us. It's been wonderful having you all here today. Thank you so much, Wanda, for organizing this. Thank you, Selena and Imara and Amy and Lisa Korak and everyone who's behind the scenes working. And of course, a huge thank you to you, Adrian, for being our guest speaker today. It was a wonderful session, very inspiring. I'm so delighted to hear what you're up to these days, and I wish you well. Good luck, everyone. Stay safe out there. Be kind to one another, and we hope to see you again at the next webinar. Bye-bye.